Good evening. I am Belita Simpson, Regional Director at Chicago Public Library. Welcome to our third annual Juneteenth event. Tonight's virtual event will explore Hulu's six-part docuseries, The 1619 Project. This television documentary series is adapted from The 1619 Project, a New York Times Magazine journalism project that focuses on slavery in the United States. The television documentary series is hosted by Nikole Hannah-Jones with Oprah Winfrey as the executive producer. However, the journalism project launched in the New York Times Magazine in 2019 and focused on the arrival of the first slave ship in the early American colonies as the starting point for a different national origin story of the United States. The project aims to demonstrate that slavery has shaped every aspect of American life since then, from policing to justice to capitalism, and the recognition of this fact is the essential intent of this historical work. This journalism project evolved into an anthology, a book of selective writings known as the 1619 Project, A New Origin. This journalism project was initiated by Nikole Hannah-Jones as a result of the investigative journalism she found on racial inequities in education. Tonight, we welcome you to sit back, relax, and enjoy an engaging conversation about the 1619 Project. And now I would like to introduce our amazing moderator for the evening. Sylvia Ewing serves as Principal Director of Partnerships and Communications at Elevate Energy, a Chicago-based nonprofit working on equity through climate change. Sylvia has worked on both sides of the microphone, helping nonprofits communicate effectively and manage change as an award-winning journalist in radio, television, and print. You can see Sylvia on PBS as a host of National Pledge Drives or moderating a special event for the Chicago Public Library. Welcome, Sylvia. It's great to have you back this evening.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. What a wonderful panel and a great achievement for you. Another Juneteenth conversation. We're going to dive right into it. I welcome everyone who's viewing us on the social channels. We're going to first speak with Dr. Jelani Cobb, and then we'll open up the conversation to speak with Tracy D. Hall and Gerard McClendon. But starting with you, Jelani, which gave me permission to call you that, so I gave you both. I'm thrilled to connect with you. You represent a journalist perspective. Journalism is also one of the spaces that has been under attack with your work on Frontline and with your writings. You make these complex issues more accessible for people. So help us connect the dots between the attacks that we are seeing on accurate and fair information and projects like 1619 and just the climate that we find ourselves in. Thank you.
So first I want to say thank you for the invitation, and I'm happy to be here to participate in this conversation. Unfortunately, I'm not in Chicago. I'm in San Francisco right now. But I'm there digitally and there in spirit. In 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois published a book called Black Reconstruction. Crucial book. Very many people are familiar with it, and in it, he traces the history of that 12-year period that followed the end of the Civil War. And writing by himself, he was offering a new interpretation of what had happened in those dozen years, because prior to that period of time, in which African Americans, many of them former slaves, had gained positions of prominence, had been elected to Southern legislatures, had been elected to governorships, and even to the United States Senate. This incredible groundswell of actual democracy that happens in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. And then it is violently and immediately swept away, which is discussed in the series as well. But he writes another addendum to this book called The Propaganda of History. And in it, he talks about why the interpretation, not only the facts that he lays out about Reconstruction, but why the interpretation of Reconstruction was so heavily politicized. And he essentially points out that history had been crafted in order to rationalize the present state of affairs. He published his book in 1935, still in the midst of Jim Crow, which arose in the aftermath of Reconstruction. And it arose to try to reduce Black people to a condition that was as close to slavery as possible if you couldn't have the actual thing. And so there came to be a corresponding agenda to denounce and to castigate and to criticize this experiment with democracy that took place in the United States. We have seen iterations of that ever since then. Du Bois laid it out, but we have seen versions and varieties of this since then. And so when you look at what is happening now across the country, where there are book bans and there are legislatures passing laws to prohibit, like they did in Florida, to prohibit the AP African American Studies course, and to try to curate the information that people have access to, it's because they're trying to rationalize a particular set of politics that exist in this moment right now. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about why we don't have the full strength of the Voting Rights Act, why it has not been reauthorized. If we're talking about why we have not seen meaningful federal level police reform and policing reform in the aftermath of now the 3 years since George Floyd was killed.
And I know Dr. Cobb will expand the conversation, because when we bring in Tracy and Gerard, they will have more to say on all of those topics. But just while I have you exclusively, I'd like to ask another bit of your leaning into your media literacy. This 1619 project, the library was able to make it accessible on Hulu or via Hulu for everyone, but it was a very hard-won series. Can you speak a little bit about why these kinds of projects in mainstream media have been so challenging to complete, and what makes the whole 1619 initiative unique?
Well, I actually think the opposite. I think that we're seeing more work like this than ever before. And I really commend Nikole Hannah-Jones and Oprah for creating the circumstances where this came about. I'm also, impressed by all the work that Ava DuVernay is doing. And how Array, which is a distribution company, has made all of those films available, for people to get around these bans that are happening in state legislatures. And I think that Ryan Coogler, who I interviewed recently about all the work that he's doing, and the reason he does the work that he does, I think that one thing that makes me hopeful is the fact that so many African Americans have found ways to get these messages out, and in so many different mediums right now. That's one way that we can fight back from the decades and really centuries-long marginalization of these facts in the first place.
Well, I like that. That's a nice workaround and an expansive view. I just remember when they were acting as if Nikole Hannah-Jones wanted to, eat puppies with this work.
Well, if you mean that, absolutely. You mean the
yeah, but
reaction?
I
Yeah, sure.
appreciate your perspective. Let's
Mhm.
bring in the rest of our panel, if we may. We're also joined by Tracy D. Hall. She was appointed the American Libraries Association's 10th executive director in its 143-year history in 2020. And just this April, our Tracy, we're going to always claim her here in Chicago, was added to the annual list of 100 most influential people in the world. And as someone who's overseeing the largest library association in the world, we couldn't ask for a better person to have the mic and to, have the platform. So yay for Tracy, welcome. And we're also joined by Dr. Gerard McClendon, Associate Professor at Chicago State University, author of Ask, and Donda's Rules and other books. And he is an award-winning scholar who lives in Chicago with his family. And we're happy to have you all here joining us for this 1619 Project Chicago Public Library special event. And it is the library's anniversary. So, we're celebrating that birthday as always, too. So I'm going to just start actually with you, Mr. McClendon. You had a lot to say about your perspective on why projects like these are important. I'll just pass you the mic. What are your thoughts?
Thank you so much. And I want to commend the august panel that you put together along with the Chicago Public Libraries. First, the 1619 Project, it gives me, as well as any other educator, teacher, or professor, it gives us more juice and confidence to be a researcher and a professor. Not only does it remind us of history and how the country was built, but the project exposes hypocrisy of the United States. So it's interesting to see the diabolical action of banning books, including the 1619 Project, occurring right now. And here's the irony or the tragedy. People are banning books that they've never read. They haven't read one word. Ban that book. So the whole media banning efforts actually reinforce how powerfully true books and films can become. The series mentions that African Americans are the perfecters and protectors of democracy because we're always the ones that test it. We're the qualitative and quantitative. We're the interview protocol and autoethnography when it comes to deconstructing democracy. The sad part is that Black people, we have to be the players, the referees, the spectators, and media all at the same time. So the 1619 Project is a wake-up call for us to keep telling and revealing history and the truth.
Thank you. Thank you for that opening. Tracy Hall, the same to you. What does this project mean to you?
Well, I definitely want to pick up on what Dr. McClendon shared, because I think that the project, and I'm really happy to have visual evidence, right? Because I do think that it's such a compliment to the written word. There's so much realia, so many archives are uncovered, real and figurative archives. And I think that it comes back again and again to this notion of democracy. And I really picked up on one particular quote: without African Americans, this country might not be a democracy at all. And I want to just call out what we already know, that when we talk about censorship today, right, what we see at the epicenter of those challenges is once again challenging and censoring and seeking to erase the lived experiences of people of color, and primarily Black and Indigenous people of color, and also people who identify as GLBTQIA, as well as the lived experiences of those people. So it feels like, once again, history is repeating itself. And we also know that during both enslavement as well as during Reconstruction, as we see evidence of, there are so many restrictions on reading and linking reading literacy or low literacy to whether or not people will be politically enfranchised, right? Whether or not they will have access to the vote. So I think that one thing we have to connect when we talk about a democracy is that we're always in this country sort of determining whether or not the aperture to democracy is going to be small and exclude most of us, or be widened. And we have to see literacy as the pathway to widening that aperture. So then there should be no question as to why we see rises in censorship today. It really is about power hoarding, and it's about trying to close off disenfranchisement or enfranchisement so that only few can vote and only few are seen as legitimate when it comes to voting.
Thank you. You shared so much there, just connecting again a lot of dots for all of us. I'd like to know, you shared a quote that was meaningful to you. Was there anything, Dr. Cobb, Dr. McClendon, that surprised you from the Hulu series or the 1619 project? And Dr. Cobb, I'll come to you.
So I wouldn't say surprised, but I would say that one of the things that I appreciated was the reporting work that went into finding families that were, and individuals that were representative of, these bigger historical movements. So, just one example is the couple whose marriage, vows couldn't be completed by the state of Virginia without them registering their race, and how that practice dated back to the origins of the one-drop rule in Virginia and the prohibitions against interracial marriage. And so we experience these things. We can look these things up and understand them intellectually as these big phenomena, but we're also experiencing these things in our lives. That the practices that we talk about, the things that we see as historical phenomena, the things that have impacted our history, so heavily, are actually there in our day-to-day existence. And I think that was one of the aspects of the project that I really thought was impressive.
Thank you for that. Dr. McClendon?
Yes, not too surprised by much. However, I was very moved and hurt by the violent gynecological experiments done on Black women, and this needs to be heard, and this story continues to need to be told so people will know the history. Voter suppression, not surprised. The power of music in the series, not surprised. But how capitalism and the slave trade were basically siblings, if not spouses, that was the part of the film that was the underlying thread to it all. Like, whenever I go to a big city and I see skyscrapers, I'm like, those skyscrapers would not exist without the slave trade. When you think about the insurance companies and the banks that were built on the slave trade that still exist today, these things need to be exposed. 1619 Project does that. Futures were traded on Black women like stocks, right? Slavers couldn't wait until girls became pregnant. The biggest surprise for me, and I heard it before, but I should have called Jelani Cobb to verify it years ago, but Nile Rodgers was a Black Panther section leader. I was like, oh, I love that.
Can I just say,
not just a great guitar player, right?
Nile Rodgers is possibly the most underappreciated brother in America. He has done everything. And get this, if we're on the subject of Nile Rodgers, right? not only does he have all of the incredible, soul and funk and disco music that he did, he can do any kind of, music, popular music, but the first hip hop song, Rapper's Delight, they were rapping over Good Times, which was a song that Nile Rodgers produced. So indirectly, he produced the first big hip hop song. So he's at the cornerstone of hip hop too.
Yes.
Yeah, he's
all praise to Nile Rodgers.
I love it. Our very own Forrest Gump, but in
That's
real
right.
life, above and beyond. I want to go back to something that you touched on, and that was that period of Reconstruction, this moment of hope, this moment when folks who had been dehumanized showed up and brought skill, talent, brilliance, integrity, until it all came crashing down violently. And in some moments, it feels like we are mirroring both the best of times that were represented by Reconstruction and the worst of times that were represented by the response. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and not putting words in your mouth, but best of times, worst of times, parallels. Tracy, I'm going to come to you because it feels like many of the very institutions that helped people pick up in the civil rights movement, free and independent media, libraries, all of that, children's television, all those things are under attack. So your thoughts about the parallels?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I have to say one thing about Nile Rodgers, right? Because I agree that he is severely underrated for a lot of reasons, particularly because of his musical virtuosity. But I also want to speak to, as he talked about disco, right? The rise and demise of disco, we have to call out disco for the intersectional sort of cultural moment that it provided, right? Women, Black people, lower income, GLBTQIA, gender non-conforming, all of the things that are posing a threat right now that people are wanting to ban books around drag, Queen Story Hour. Since when did America get down on drag? I mean, we have a whole history of it in our country, vaudeville being just one of them. But I think that it really, that moment for me in the film, it was interesting to hear you all talk about Nile Rodgers, because that was an aha moment. It felt so prescient for him to talk about disco and talk about why disco was violently attacked in the way that it was. And I think that it brings us back to book banning, right? When we think about Black code laws, when we think about Reconstruction, we're talking about one of the most punishable and egregiously so infractions that a Black or white person could make was to either be caught reading or to teach a Black person to read. We're talking about from Louisiana to Virginia to Missouri. We're talking about jail time, lashes for white people as well as fines. And for some Black people, it meant the cutting off of fingers and the gouging out of eyes. I don't want to be particularly explicit, but we have to tell it. We have to talk about what these compulsory illiteracies, as I call them, what the cost was then and what the cost is now. Because today in libraries, we are trying to respond to adult literacy and adult low literacy. And what I could tell you is that anybody who lives in a geography in which Black people were punished for reading, still to this day in 2023 has low literacy. If I were to superimpose the map of 1843 from Missouri and show you those states, right, that were slave trading states. And if we were to look at which state have the lowest literacy in this country, I'm talking about native English speakers having the lowest rate of literacy in this country, it's the same geographies. So I think that the film also suggests that that's where we also see intractable poverty, where land is taken away from people willfully. So I guess what I want to say is I want to do what Nile Rodgers does so well. He connects the dots between the suppression of a lot of cultural phenomena when we think about disco. And what I want to do, and I think what my co-panelists are doing, is connecting the dots between voting rights, compulsory illiteracy or low literacy, where we see rapid contemporary gentrification, and where we have seen Black geographies just stolen and our stories erased. It's all connected. And I think that's why, for me, the 1619 Project was so banned, utterly banned, is because it is probably one of the vehicles that we have that connects all of these issues together in a poignant way, but in a powerful way.
Beautifully shared. I'll come to you, Mr. McClendon.
Thank you. A follow-up to that, in episode 3, when I first started watching the Black music episode, I instantly, I got goosebumps firstly. But secondly, I was like, is this going to be told in a way that's going to be somewhat sanitized? That was the first thing I was worried about. And the second thing I was worried about, are they going, is the 1619 Project episode 3 going to tell stories that we already know? Both of my notions were blown away. They went deeper into Motown history. They went deeper into race records and the importance of jazz music as a defiant method of moving throughout society, code switching, Louis Armstrong as the classic code switcher, and it showed the stolen legacy in music. Nile Rodgers is the bridge, right? As a Black Panther could only do so well. I mean, it takes Nile Rodgers to work with Pharrell, with Daft Punk, with David Bowie. It takes Nile Rodgers to work with the funkiest of all funketeers, as well as rock and rollers. And what does he do it with? He does it with 2 instruments born in Africa, the guitar and the drum. And that's where the 1619 Project works the best. See, here's the thing. If you look at any white American hit song pre-1975, that hit song probably was written by a Black person. And then if you go before 1970, the music was just flat out stolen. So, whether it's a Little Richard song, whether it's a Jackie Wilson song, they come to the Black neighborhood, they find out where the good music is, they re-record the same record in a more homogenized way, and it becomes a million seller because there's a white face on the music. And so the 1619 Project episode 3 exposes that. We as a people, we are demonized until the oppressors can make some money off of us.
Well, there is a long pattern of repurposing brilliance in a more palatable, with a more palatable messenger for control, is another way that I would say it. We love in this music episode, there's a focus on capitalism, on fear, democracy, justice. Jelani Cobb, say a little bit more about it, how any of those episodes spoke to you.
I was thinking about the episode on fear, because, what it gets at is the way in which we have a whole infrastructure of public policy that is based on an emotional sentiment. And so it's not simply that people feel, this fear in the abstract, and they deal with it and they go about life, the way that people do. No, we actually have public policy enacted on the basis of the paranoia that people who were stolen from their homelands and forced to labor without compensation might one day rise up and actually demand their freedom. That they might do what any other rational, reasonable group of human beings subjected to that circumstance would do. And that the creation of the policing, the mechanisms for policing this population have the DNA of the problems that we see right now. And, you know, Nikole and I have known each other for a long time. And so we have covered some of these same stories. We have had the conversations, you know, that journalists have when they're covering, you know, the same kinds of situations. And there's, you know, even really a whole group of us, you know, going from Ferguson to Baltimore, you know, with Freddie Gray, to Minnesota with Philando Castile, which is, you know, explored in that episode, to, we could just kind of go around. You know, we saw each other in Tulsa, you know, at the commemoration. And so we understand this because we see the contemporary manifestations of it and the connection of this to this one dynamic that she distills down very aptly to white fear.
Yeah, thank you for sharing so much on that. It does, you know, tend to make people act in ways that they think are in their self-interest, but truly are attacks on democracy in so many ways. Tracy, same thing to you about other episodes and other thoughts?
Yeah, so all of them, right, are compelling. I found myself rewatching race and capitalism, you know, and of course they're intertwined. There's so much I could say about the capitalism piece, that we can't have capitalism in this country without not only racism and enslavement, but also prisons, right? When we think today about, you know, one of the quotes, I spent a lot of time in Alabama, you know, the last 3 years, and just the reminder that the selling of prison labor has become, in some geographies, particularly in Alabama, one of the lead economic drivers. And it makes me think about the fact that one of the largest bans on information access, on reading, on libraries is happening every day inside the prison walls, right? With the rise of the privatization of prisons, that goal of mitigating recidivism or people returning to prison, that has been erased because the profit motive for a for-profit prison actually benefits from recidivism, or people coming back. So what we've seen is that we've seen the erasure of libraries, or library service, of education or literacy services, of even access to the GED in some prisons. And it's no accident that one of the last states in the Union to create this really comprehensive moratorium on the right to read during enslavement was Missouri. And in April or May, Missouri became the first state that that voted in its state legislature to defund public libraries if access to banned books, which a judge had said should be permitted, if in fact those books like 1619 Project were returned to the shelves. So again, we sort of have to see compulsory literacy and then the denial of the right to read for the public in contemporary America happening. So I was excited when I heard that Representative Emanuel Cleaver was introducing the Prison Libraries Act, which is right now before Congress, asking for the vote to ratify $60 million over 6 years, go to to prisons around the country in grant form, should they seek to restore library or literacy services, or even career services for people who might be returning to their communities, like digital skills. So that connection between race and labor and disenfranchisement was there. And of course, as I think Dr. McClendon said, the centrality of women. And that is something that I have to think about, right? Because I'm the first Black woman to hold my position. And so as we fight censorship, as we fight information redlining, right? Which means that some people in Chicago have free, silky internet, and other people is buffering again and again because there's been poor investment a lot of times on the South and West Side, poor investment in fiber. You know, I think about a lot, what does my leadership mean, and how will I be judged as a leader, as a Black woman, if I don't interrogate the systems that seek to silence us or that seek to continue to create information disparity?
Well, we have the right.
Can I add something really quick here?
Please.
So I want to add something, which is that there's a series that Jay-Z and Rock Nation have produced, and they've done it with A&E, and it is called Exposing Parchment. And it is about the contemporary abuses that people are experiencing at Parchment Prison, which is discussed in the 1619 docuseries as well, and the way that Parchment was used against the civil rights workers and its origins as a slave plantation. Well, there are people who are suffering horrific conditions now. No water, no heat, mold, people living in prison cells that they can't leave, the people who have been in their cells for 9, 10, 11 months with no chance for exercise, no chance to see daylight. People are in cells that they lost the keys to. They couldn't let them out of if they wanted to. And sewage that backs up, people with 2 or 3, 4 inches of sewage in their cells. And this is happening right now. And so that series exposes what's going on there now, and it's a good companion to
the American Library Association. And we are probably asking and discussing some of the same things that you thought about when you looked at the Hulu series or read part of the special book that was put together around the series. Making these comparisons then and now, I do remember the heat that was around the 1619 project, and that's where I was going, Jelani, earlier. Can you talk a little bit about how things get weaponized?
Sure.
The information that should just be information in a country that said we care about information, and yet it's not. And I'll start with you.
Well, the problem is the implications of that information. So what Nikole did with this project is challenge the facile, simplistic notion of American, untrammeled, undiluted, entirely pure, good intention, benevolence in the world as a force of only that. Its origins are in fighting against the tyranny of the British Crown and establishing all these humanistic ideals of the Enlightenment, and that it has grown as a beacon of freedom across the world, all these things. And she's saying, wait, hold on, wait, let me see, hold on. What about the people you were buying and selling? What about the people you were raping? What about the children you stole from their mothers and sold for profit? What about the people you murdered? What about the land that you stole in order to exploit the labor that we've been talking about? What do all those things mean? And so, as I said, this is all about kind of current rationales. When we look at, people who derive a moral standing from the simplistic narrative of America's past, it means that you then can broadcast to the world. You can move across the world with the kind of swagger, the kind of authority that comes from that kind of moral behavior. And so they're high stakes. This is why that project was attacked in the way that it was. And one of the things that you'll notice is that you saw the most vitriolic attacks on the 1619 project came from people who were not historians. You did not see organized historians, one or two. There were a few historians who took issue with this, that. Overwhelmingly, I'm in those communities. I'm in those conversations. I have a PhD in American history. That wasn't where people came down. People, oh, okay, I think it mostly gets right. I disagree with this thing or that thing or whatever, but mostly it's, I'm on board with it. Those were the conversations we were hearing. The people who were up in arms, the people who had no credibility what to speak of, or as I like to say, these were people for whom the only book with their name on it was their checkbook. They weren't part of the conversation.
Well, and Dr. McClendon, that's where you were going as well, but share your thoughts on weaponization of history.
Yeah,
And access to information.
thank you for that, Jelani. My God, I mean, you have people that don't even read, who purposely don't read, and have the audacity to say, you shouldn't read that. That's bad for my child. I mean, yeah, look, let me keep my thoughts clear here. Episode 5. I agree with you, Dr. Cobb. It was hard to watch, turning Black men into the boogeyman, right? The art of deputizing white people. You can't even go bird watching. How innocent. The most innocent act in the world is have a set of binoculars, go into Central Park and watch the birds, right?
You're talking about that particular case as well.
Absolutely. You
I'll
can't
call
go
the police on you, white woman.
Right. You can't go for a jog. You can't be a passenger in a car without being considered a criminal, and as far as justice, grandfather clauses and legacy admission to higher institutional educational centers, that's affirmative action. But there are very few white people that want to call a grandfather clause or a legacy admission affirmative action. The contradictions were rampant. I've got a C average with no extracurriculars and no community service, but I should get into Harvard because my granddaddy went. Well, maybe you should reconsider. The other thing that was horrifying to me was the Homestead Act. 246 million acres given to white families, and 46 million white families are still living on the land today. How dare you deny African Americans reparations?
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to come over to you, Tracy, but I have to do a little bit of a PBS moment where I get so much of my information and also often under attack. But there was a recent series talking about immigration and actually Jewish immigration to the country. And one of the participants said, they wanted white people to come. They just wanted as many additional white folks that we could get to migrate. So, Tracy, coming to you for this, the underlying theme that, Dr. Larry Ward, a Buddhist, and social intellectual, has an invitation for America to heal its racial karma and talks about all of this. But share the ways in which we seem to hurt all of us to prevent some of us from getting a little bit too much information in some people's perspective. I invite you to not only look at the series, but help us understand what's at stake in weaponizing laws against librarians.
Well, I think when we think about what a contemporary library does, right, we are thinking about the fact that it is today, especially as public space has contracted or as it's being erased, right? We know that libraries, whether they're school libraries or public libraries, community college libraries, are the most visited public service in the country, right? Before the pandemic, 1 billion visits. We also know that in addition to books, libraries are home to so many programs that people rely on. So we're talking about GED programs, we're talking about literacy, family literacy, early learning. Some libraries offer services to people who have memory loss, whether it's dementia or Alzheimer's. We're talking about digital navigation. Today, the number one reason why people are coming into libraries is because they need help navigating either very sophisticated information or very advanced information platform, right? So we're talking about the fact that we have high expectations and high stakes when it comes to information, meaning that quality of life indicators like access to education, access to employment, access to public health are all predicated on really robust skill sets when it comes to information navigation and really advanced tools. And I'm not even talking about artificial intelligence or augmented reality or chat GPT. I'm just talking about the average interfaces that people use today. We have so many people who stand to be left behind in terms of education, employment, public health, access to government. And so when we talk about banning libraries or when we allow the conversation around censorship to mean that some people will choose to close libraries down, we're talking about not only socioeconomic disenfranchisement, but also the end of civic literacy or civic fluency. And one thing I want to do is I just have to connect the dots because we're talking about censorship and rightly so, but there is a value chain that begins with misinformation, which is just wrong information, right? Disinformation, which is intentionally wrong information. Information disparity or information redlining, in which some people have access to information or good information and other people don't. And then the end of that, the most egregious form is information withdrawal, meaning that we take information that is in the public realm and we remove it for some groups or for all groups because we see it as dangerous or threatening. And that is what censorship is. So I definitely want to say that we should be very afraid and we should worry about what other civil liberties we will lose if we allow book banning to stand, because anytime you ban books and ban reading, that is the prelude to totalitarianism. It is the prelude to fascism.
On the day after Juneteenth, when some of us were resting or being with our families or just basking in that moment, this is a reality check about where we are in 2023. And the continuum that Tracy has laid out, the myth, the misinformation, disinformation, disparity, and information withdrawal is something that we need to be aware of. I know in Illinois, we have passed laws to support and protect our libraries, but we do have to think about our neighboring states. We have to think about where you're joining us from, Jelani. We have to think about everyone because there are no borders for the kind of dangerous path that we can find ourselves on. But I want to go back to something a little bit more lighthearted, at least for me, and that was the Motown segment. We gave Niles Rodgers a lot of play. And Chicago, we like to brag that every good thing in the world came from here. But the Motown segment was very interesting. Mr. McClendon, can you share any of your thoughts about that segment? And I'll pass it to all of you.
The segment showed just how special Motown was and still is. I mean, West Grand Boulevard, you go back there today, you go to the museum, and the nostalgic feeling that you get in those studios is it's almost, it's not haunting, it's revealing more than anything how they got all of that great music out of what people would deem as lower class African Americans, in a, less than a 6 or 7 block radius, putting all of that beautiful, harmonious music together to share with the world. If there's no Berry Gordy, that doesn't happen. Arguably the world's greatest poet and songwriter, Smokey Robinson, helped to build that, along with the amazing artists and Berry Gordy. Berry Gordy studying the factory, Berry Gordy studying the assembly line. How can I turn an automotive assembly line? How can I make that similar to something in music? And so that Motown segment was just tear-jerking to see these beautiful Black people get dressed up, sound beautiful, travel the world representing African Americans and Africans all around the world, being utterly humiliated, but still getting on stage, right? Having to go to the back door of hotels and restaurants, but still being able to sing, "You Better Shop Around." So it's just a beautiful segment. I love the way they couched it in the beauty of the music as well as the struggle that was taking place for those musicians.
Well, I asked the right one to summarize the Motown episode. We are wrapping up this part of our hour. I'm going to ask you, before your closing remarks, just a closing thought for me. I have to say that a good friend's mother passed away, a local journalist, and I was able to spend time with her before she passed. And she made it a point. This was Miss Gwendolyn Washington, Laura Washington's mom. We're all family in Chicago, Jelani. That's how we roll. But her mom said that when she came north, her father had told her, you must go to the libraries. You must always go and continue to learn, because we're not allowed to, they don't want us to. And he lived in a life where it went from like illegal for him to some like very unequal facility. And it just, in 2023, I've known her for decades. She wanted to talk about that. And I gave her that quote, "Free people read freely." And so that tying into keeping us from information is, to me, the most powerful thing about the 1619 Project and the Hulu series, the power of information, the lengths that people will go to create structural barriers and systematic ways to keep us all back. And Tracy, you've done a beautiful job to show it not only hurts the people for whom it's intended, but it hurts everyone, as you mentioned, with the low literacy rates. Jelani Cobb, what was the biggest takeaway for you from the series?
It's very hard to distill it down to a single thing. But what I think the big picture overall is the way in which we've had this transformative impact on this nation, that, we arrived here and were intended to be chattel, we're intended to be property. And we, by force of will and resilience and persistence, rerouted the path of the most powerful nation that's ever existed on the planet. And all of the different ways that we look at that, manifest in that series, I think that's probably the most central of them.
Thank you. Gerard McClendon, not your final thoughts, but your thoughts on the series takeaway.
My series takeaway, I think, directly correlates with libraries and being literate. The fact that there's a 1619 project done with Nikole Hannah-Jones and the New York Times, and then it's made into a series of films. That's a beautiful thing, because what it does is it opens our eyes saying, wait a minute, we should be reading more. I'll never forget, in college, I was reading a book a week, and I remember getting my first library card. And I was like, Mama, Daddy, you mean I can take 15 books home and keep them for 3 weeks? I said, why doesn't everyone have a library card? And it made me think, and this series made me think. Back in the 1990s, I was a reference librarian, and there was this man named Henry who lived near a rail yard. He used to come in the library every day, and I asked him, I said, Henry, why do you read so many? He read 7 newspapers a day. Then he would go to magazines, and then he would read books. I said, why are you reading all these books? And so I'm waiting for this profound answer. He says, Gerard, I'm reading all these books because they're here.
Thank you, Henry. That is a wonderful, wonderful point.
You know what I'm saying? And so that's what we have to do. We have to keep reading because it's here. It's the human legacy. And this is how we spread civilization, by making sure that everyone is literate.
Tracy, your thoughts on the takeaway from the series?
Wow, that was beautiful. That was beautiful, Dr. McClendon. I would say, obviously, the literacy and the connection of that to enfranchisement. But I think the thing that really stirred me was my own grappling with the American flag. And I really came away from the series feeling a different sense of relationship, both ownership and stewardship. And I remember twice in my life, I've had a deep conversation about the flag. Once when I first came home from college, and I was a freshman in college, first year student, and I came home to celebrate a summer holiday. It was the 4th of July. I just came home really for the cookout and all that fun. And there my mom was flying this big American flag. And before I would even come into the house, I had to ask my mom, Mom, you've been through so much. There's a lot about labor and about unions. My mom was really active in a union, and the union hadn't been done well very recently. And so I was just like, Mom, why? And she talked about it with me. And then later, my aunt, who died literally just days before I accepted the position at the American Library Association, who had really raised me the rest of the way, we had a family reunion. Our family's from Louisiana, but we had the family reunion here in Chicago, because we go to different places where various ones of us live. And my aunt, on the day that we were having the big family dinner, my aunt comes in a blouse that is the Stars and Stripes blouse. And I said, Auntie, that's what you're gonna wear? And she said, yeah, because I earned it. So
that's the reminder.
I would say it's the reckoning with the flag. And after this series, understanding what my aunt meant and what my mother meant and what Nicole's father means when they fly that flag, because they put some sweat and some blood into that flag. And there is a sense of ownership. And today, for those of us continuing the fight, there has to be a sense of stewardship.
I do love that. That is a beautiful way of reflecting on it. And, just staying with the flag theme before your concluding remarks. I remember a point when I said, well, I fly the flag of Chicago, and that's my first flag. But we did work for it. And I have in my family room my picture of my Uncle David, a baby in World War II, and the post-traumatic stress and all of these things that we didn't have words for, that he and the Korean War veterans, and you just name it, going from Christmas addicts up, we do own a part of the flag. And one of my greatest pains, being an international traveler, visiting friends in England who flew the flag. When my husband and I were there, they flew an American flag. And when I saw those January 6th rioters, the shame upon the flag, internationally was something that was on my mind. But enough about my thoughts of flags. We've had a very thoughtful conversation about a powerful series that remains a resource that families can discuss, that we can use to have conversations, and not just with those who agree with us, but with those of different perspectives, because that is how we stay civil, and that's how we uplift our societies. So your last thoughts overall on these conversations, on the series? Dr. Cobb shared word about a new series for us to pay attention to. So I'm just going to go around, starting with Dr. McClendon. Your final thoughts as we conclude our panel discussion.
I'm going to keep it real brief because I can't wait to hear everyone else's answers. So yeah, I'm wearing my heart on my sleeve right now because this is a little emotional. The project reminds us to tell our own families' stories. Those stories are so important. I don't care if it was man learning how to ride a bike at 5 years old. We need to tell these stories in our families. We need to not just have family reunions every 2 years or 4 years. You can have a family reunion through Zoom. All right, hook up with your people. We also need to get our photographs off of the internet and into real pictures. Share those pictures from your phone, print those out, give those pictures to people in your family so they can hang them on the wall, keep them in their wallet, put a few pictures on your car dashboard, real pictures. I have over 150,000 photographs, and they're all in the cloud. And I think about that. Wait a minute. I got to get some of these precious pictures out of the cloud. The 1619 Project also, I think, it prods us to start letter writing. Write a person a letter. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It could be a thank you note. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Jelani, Felita, Sylvia. Thank you. I really appreciate you. To get a letter handwritten in the mail, that's better than getting money. Because it's like that person thought about me, and the letter becomes a part of what? The historical record.
You've really made history accessible to regular folks, and that sepia print, even the shape of it in the old frame, is nothing that I can ever find on the cloud, so thank you for that. I'll come to you, Jelani Cobb, your final thoughts. And thank you also for starting us off with a little special time with you. And you're on mute.
I think that, the takeaway from this, and we're looking at Juneteenth, and, the recognition of what it took for our ancestors to endure the unthinkable. And the primary form of resistance was simply survival, continuing to survive, despite the abjectly terrible, circumstances. And so, to the point that people have raised about the flag, I'll tell you about this. I had an aunt who was my bougie aunt. I did not like going to her house. And, I thought she was so proper. I thought she was so serious. And this is actually a great aunt. And so when my mother told me that when they were all down in Alabama together, because like the Great Migration, as you all know very well, people didn't come up by themselves. They came up in groups and clusters of friends, family, and then they recreated those communities in the places where they arrived. So I lived in one street, my cousins lived 3 blocks away, another set of cousins lived 5 blocks away. And these are actual blood cousins, not play cousins, because people came up and recreated, the community that they left behind. My mother told me that when she was a little girl, this same aunt had been the one that taught them, which fork to use, and had gotten them piano lessons. And, I thought, in my 20-year-old indignation, that I could not think of anything more ridiculous than thinking about, these bourgeois rules of etiquette in the midst of Jim Crow and learning to play piano and all these things that are so proper. And it was like, I'm not interested in impressing white people. And then I grew up. And what I came to understand was that my aunt was radical. That what she said was that no portion of the world was off limits to her. That if you want to study piano in the midst of Jim Crow, then we will get you lessons to study piano. And if you want to understand this table setting, because you may be at a state dinner, we're going to aspire to you being at a state dinner, despite the fact that we're in Jim Crow right now. And my mother learned that. My mother taught me that. And I'll teach my children that, in addition to everything else, that we own as much of the world as anyone else does, including that flag. And I think that that's the principle that we should keep in mind.
What a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing. I want to be that auntie and the bad, wild auntie too. So I want to be all sides. Tracy, your final thoughts.
Well, I just have enjoyed this immensely. I have to thank Ms. Valita Simpson and the entire Chicago Public Library staff and community. Happy 150th anniversary, Chicago Public Library. I couldn't be prouder to have Chicago Public Library for my very own. So I think I want to pick up on both a little bit of what Dr. McClendon said and a little bit of what Dr. Cobb said. So I want to talk about witness when we talk about, because I'm from one of those good old Kojic Pentecostal families, right? So I want to talk about witness. Witness is what I think Dr. McClendon is urging us to do. None of this documentary could have been created without primary source material, without photographs that were there, without somebody who had the leaflet, without somebody who kept the pamphlet, somebody who kept the ID, somebody who kept the flyer, somebody who kept something. So right now, I know that people who are listening, I know that you probably have a drawer or a stash of all those things. In librarianship, we learn, number one, put like with like. So if you have photographs over time of your block, just put all those photographs together, print them out. If you have letters that you've sent or received from your family, put those all together. If you have photographs, our individual photographs might not necessarily always be valuable to people outside of our family, but as a collective, as when we identify them as Chicago South Side from 1950 to 2023, they absolutely have value. So, and here in Chicago, home of Black genius, home of BIPOC genius, if you're going to any art program, cultural program, church program, whatever, put that all together and make sure that we have that, because your archive, believe me, 50, 60 years from now, if climate change doesn't get us, it will be very, very valuable. So I definitely want to say witness, but I also want to speak to what Dr. Cobb is speaking to, which is testimony. The power of the word, of the words that we speak, and having dominion over our lived realities. Let's think about our young people and let's speak life into their life. Here in Chicago, we have a lot of work to do in terms of how we talk about our young people and how we allow other people to frame them. If you don't fight for anything else, fight for this next generation of young people. When I talk to my Native American brothers and sisters, they are always looking 7 generations into the future. Let's start looking 7 generations into the future. Let's start investing in our young people. Let's expose them to this history. Sit down and watch this series with them. get the book and gift it to them if they are interested. But most importantly, make sure that they have knowledge about their history so that they know where they're going, and lift them up and call them by their names, which is genius, which is great one, which is someone who will be a builder, someone who is an uplifter, someone who is a steward.
Well, we're coming full circle, Tracy, because we met working on issues for young people decades ago. And I think this conversation is the kind that, will live for free online. You can have those conversations with your family. We've talked about so much. We don't want to forget the incarcerated folks that Dr. Cobb mentioned. We don't want to forget what COVID did, for them, and what they're living with now, and the roots of this penal system going back to what we were exposed to in the 1619 Project. We don't want to forget the educators. We don't want to forget the folks who are working on our climate, because the climate crisis is here for all of us, but people on the front lines are primarily African American, Black and Brown, living in spaces where people felt it was okay to have, pollution. So there are so many things that this all connects to. I appreciate each of you for connecting the dots for us this evening, and to do it in an ongoing way, and not to forget the joy. Adding to what the historians have asked us to do, giving you actionable things to take away in addition to a reality check of where we are. Pamon Rami would say, right on the back of those pictures, don't forget to put the date on them. And I know that as my family prepares for a 70th family reunion, we've been doing it so far for 70 years. You learn a lot also from saving those obituaries, that and the family Bible, but those obituaries have all the information. Get the facts right. I'm Sylvia Ewing. I'm so delighted to have had this intimate conversation with Dr. Jelani Cobb, who is our special panelist and expert. You can find him, this Peabody Award winning journalist, on my home station of PBS. Dr. Gerard McClendon, a Chicago treasure, associate professor at Chicago State University. You can follow him, and our very own 100 people of importance, according to time, but we always knew and loved her in Chicago. Tracy D. Hall of the American Library Association, and celebrating 150 years, passing it back to our regional director of the Woodson Library, Valita Simpson. I'm Sylvia Ewing, and thank you for joining us.
Guys, that was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Sylvia, Jelani, Gerard, and Tracy. I would like to also give a special thank you to the Chicago Public Library Foundation. And again, this is our 150th year. We are celebrating all year long. We are challenging all of our participants, all of our community partners that are with us this evening. Let's have this conversation in your living room. Let's have this conversation in your circle of influence. Let's invite our young people to read the 1619 Project, to watch the 1619 Project on Hulu. Also, let's check out Exposing Parchment on A&E Network. That was produced by Jay-Z. We have had an enlightening conversation tonight, talking about issues that matter and impact our daily lives, and talking about history and our ability to create our own history, to save our own history, and to archive our works, the pictures that we have. So if you're interested in learning more about archiving and saving your materials, please come by the Harsh Research Collection in Woodson Library, and we will help you with that. Thanks so much for everybody participating, and you all have a good night.